All right, hello to our friends who are joining us on April 1st for our office hours. We're going to focus today on the week 12 lab packet. So this is going to be structures of the brain. This is going to be bones, bones of the skull and movements of the skull because of the muscles that are attached to it. So one of the things that we said we wanted to talk about in our group here was we were interested in talking about the meninges. So let me pull up, let's see, where's that? Oh, we're sharing it now. Let me pull up my page that has some pictures from the labeled images PowerPoint. We'll start there. Talk a little bit about meninges. So here's the picture I'm going to start with. What I'll mention for you guys is that you have this particular picture. This is in the labeled images PowerPoint for you for week 12. The picture over here on the left is new to you. So I'm going to start by using the picture over here on the left because I think it gives you a bigger picture idea of what's happening. And we'll use that to help us interpret what we see over here on the right, the picture you already had. So let's start with defining what the meninges are. When we talk about meninges, we are talking about the connective tissue that we find wrapping around the brain. Your brain is probably, we could say, the most important organ in the body. Oh, hey, I haven't asked this in a while. The brain is my favorite system. What is my favorite system? Who remembers? It's been so long. What's my favorite system that we don't get to talk about? Digestive. Look at you guys. Awesome. Yep. So we don't get to talk about the digestive system. What I will say is I will give the nervous system, that's my second favorite system because it is really important and it's really cool. So my favorite system is the digestive system. You guys get that in AMP2. But the nervous system, very important, especially when we're talking about things like the brain, because the brain controls everything for you. So my brain is very important. It keeps me alive. It helps me think. It helps me do all of these different things. Because of that, I really need to keep it safe. The way that I'm going to keep it safe, the first way is what we talked about in lecture number 1. We talked about how the bones that I find around the skull, these bones that I find around the skull are connected to each other with what are called sutures. When we talked about suture joints, sutures do or do not move. When I talk about the sutures between the skull bones. Yeah, those are what we called immovable joints, or there's no movement. So the first way I protect the brain is I put together my skull bones like this. I hold them tight. There's no movement. That's going to keep the brain safe. So the first layer of protection I have around the brain are those really tightly attached skull bones. And actually, let me zoom in to show you guys. If you look right here on my picture, you can kind of see what a suture looks like up close. So see how my bone is kind of overlapping with itself? All these little overlapping pieces here, that's a suture. That means there's going to be no movements in between those bones. So first way I protect the brain is I'm going to put together those skull bones around it, and I'm going to make sure that they don't move. The second way I protect the brain, though, is I cover it with these connective tissue membranes called the meninges. And the meninges are going to help to hold the brain in place, keep it from moving around inside and kind of be a dividing line between inside and outside of the brain. So the meninges are made out of 3 different layers of connective tissue. So you can see the names of the layers on my picture. I'm going to start at the top picture up here. The outermost layer of the meninges, or what we would call the most superficial layer, to use our directional terms, is called the Dura Mater. And the word Dura in its name means tough. So the Dura Mater is this really tough, it's also this really thick layer of connective tissue. This is my outermost connective tissue around the brain. Right underneath the Dura Mater is something called the Arachnoid Mater. Hey, when someone has arachnophobia, what are they afraid of? Arachnophobia. Yeah, we're afraid of spiders, right? So when I talk about the Arachnoid Mater, think about arachnophobia, think about fear of spiders. This layer looks a lot like spider webs. So arachnoid, just think spider webs. Go down since I'm low on space. Spider webs. When I'm looking at it in the picture, if you see all of these little white stringies inside here, that's part of the arachnoid mater. Now, the arachnoid mater has some space. Let's zoom in. You can see. Underneath the arachnoid mater, where I have all of those little stringy spider webs that give it its name, I have this little space right here. So this space that I'm looking at right here is something called the subarachnoid. I don't think, did I spell it right? Subarachnoid space. Sub means underneath. Arachnoid means the arachnoid mater. So there is a space that we find underneath the arachnoid mater where I see all of these little collagen proteins that look like spider webs. That's called the subarachnoid space. Oh yeah, thank you. Page 5, that looks like. So the arachnoid mater right here is the connective tissue layer. It starts with this white or pink layer that I see here that has all of these little spider webs that hang down, called the arachnoid mater. The last layer of connective tissue is called the Pia Mater, and the Pia Mater is attached directly to the brain. The word Pia literally means gentle. The Pia Mater is the thinnest connective tissue layer that wraps around the brain, and this is actually the layer that touches the brain directly. So the arachnoid mater is a little bit away from the brain. It's got this space here called the subarachnoid space. Underneath the subarachnoid space is where I find the Pia Mater, and the Pia Mater is the connective tissue layer that's directly attached to the brain. So in your lab packet, it asks you to go from superficial to deep, I believe, or you might see on the homework assignment that yours asks you to go from deep to superficial. Either way, the order of them is we start on the outside. The outermost layer is called the Dura Mater, the tough layer. The middle layer is the Arachnoid Mater, the spiderweb layer, and then the innermost layer is the Pia Mater, which is the gentle layer or the very thin layer. So let's transition over to the picture that looks a little bit more like your model. We'll look at our picture here and then we'll try to label that model together. I am looking at, to orient ourselves a little bit, this picture over on the left. When we were looking at the brain, we sliced the brain into a left piece and a right piece in the picture over here. Now, I know it's been a long time since we talked about body planes, but when I talk about cutting the body into a left piece and a right piece, does anyone remember what kind of plane we use to chop into a left and a right? Yeah, there we go. We got some people chiming in, especially when I cut into an equal left and a right, which is what we see in the picture that we're looking at down here. We're looking at the brain in this picture from what we call a midsagittal view. I chopped the brain in half going straight through your nose to see either the left side or the right side. When we move to this next picture that we're looking at right here, rather than chopping the brain into a left side and a right side, the way that I've cut this brain is into an anterior piece and a posterior piece. What kind of plane cuts my body into anterior and posterior? Yeah, I got a couple of us that are chiming in here. This picture that I'm looking at on the right shows the brain cut with what's called a coronal plane. So a coronal plane divides the body into a front piece and a back piece. So we're seeing something different now than we saw on our other picture. Now we're looking at the meninges that are wrapped around both of the hemispheres. So on this side of my picture is one of the hemispheres of the brain. Over here on this side of my picture is the other hemisphere of the brain. Now, a quick reminder for us that there are two types of tissue that I see inside the brain. Inside the brain, I have an outermost layer. This outermost layer here is gray matter. It's not confusing. We're literally using the word gray. Gray matter for its color. More inside the brain, we have white matter for its color. So the stuff that I see on the outside of the brain. And when you guys start studying the brain for lecture, which hopefully will be toward the end of this week here, you start working. The gray matter is found on the outside, the white matter found in the middle. The reason the white matter looks so white is because it has a whole bunch of myelin. So the outer layer of the brain, more on the outside here, right next to where we'd find our thinnest meninge layer, our gentle meninge layer here, the Pia Mater. Right next to that is the gray matter of the brain. And it looks gray because it doesn't have a lot of myelin, but more toward the inside, it's going to look white. And that's where I have a bunch of myelin, and that's called the white matter of the brain. Yes, Martha, I know this, but a lot of the features that we're talking about are very similar to what's on page 5. So it's not going to match exactly, but you have this in the labeled images PowerPoint. All right, so we've got our two hemispheres, our two cerebral hemispheres that we see here. Here's the gray matter that's on the outside of the brain. Attached to that gray matter, I see here the Pia Mater, that really thin connective tissue layer. And I see it over here on this side as well, the Pia Mater. So the Pia Mater is the layer of the meninges that attaches directly to the brain. On top of the Pia Mater, see this blue space that we see in here. This blue space that we see in here is something that we already talked about called the Subarachnoid Space. The Subarachnoid Space is the one we saw on our other picture that looked like it had spider webs in it. So this is a fluid-filled space that we see there called the Subarachnoid Space, which means on the outside of the subarachnoid, and the best place to try to label it. See that purple layer that I see there? I'll try to zoom in on it just a little bit. The purple layer that I see right here is going to be my Arachnoid Mater. So my spider web layer there is that purple layer that's found above subarachnoid space. So the subarachnoid space is this fluid-filled space right here. Right above it is where I find the Arachnoid Mater. The outermost layer of my meninges was called the Dura Mater, and the Dura Mater is the white layer that I see right here. So the white layer, the Dura Mater, it's so thick that there are actually places where it splits in half. So if you see this area right here where I see the dark blue, this dark blue area that I see right here is something called the dural sinus, or sometimes you'll see it called the dural venous sinus. I believe that's the way we refer to it in the packet, the dural venous sinus. That middle word venous in it means that it's a vein. The dural venous sinus is this open space in between the parts of the Dura Mater. It's so thick it can split in half. And there's places where it splits in half, allows it to store blood. So there's actually blood in the middle of the Dura Mater in these places called the dural venous sinus. We're going to get to the picture on page 5. So that sounds right, maybe, that it's the tan colored one. So we're going there. I just wanted to point out for us our stuff that has labels on it. So the dural venous sinus up here, that's my open space in the parts of the dura that have blood. I haven't mentioned it yet. Maybe a couple of us have figured it out from the lab packet. This subarachnoid space that we talked about, this is a fluid-filled space too. Did anyone read about what kind of fluid I find in a subarachnoid space? Does anybody know yet what kind of fluid I find in this blue area right here? Yeah, that's where I find the spinal fluid. Yep. So the subarachnoid space is the home to the special type of fluid that we call cerebrospinal fluid, or if we want to abbreviate it, which is totally acceptable, we just CSF, cerebrospinal fluid. That's another way that we protect your brain. Is your brain is inside your skull and it's literally like floating around. So it's floating around inside this cerebrospinal fluid, and the cerebrospinal fluid is what we find in the area called the subarachnoid space. So yeah, it absorbs shock, It helps when your head goes forward and your brain kind of shifts with it. It gives you a little bit of a barrier between the bones and your brain. So yeah, it's all about protecting you there. That's cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so this is a picture that you have in the labeled images PowerPoint. It is also the picture that's in the guided lesson. The model that it best matches with, someone told me this on page 5, so the model that this is most closely matched with is this one right here. So let's try to orient ourselves with this model compared to the picture that we were looking at on page 5. So first thing that we're going to work on labeling or identifying, on our list here, we need to know where the cerebrum is. Now, when we were talking about the cerebrum on the previous slide, we were talking about what are called the cerebral hemispheres. The cerebral hemispheres. Remember that you have a left half and a right half of your cerebrum. So this word hemisphere just means halves. So the cerebrum, I like to call the cerebrum, by the way, like the thinking part of your brain. It's the part that really makes you human. So the cerebrum is the part of your brain that we do all of our functions inside of, thinking, moving, seeing, all that kind of stuff. So on our picture, we're just labeling it the cerebrum. What we're actually looking at is one half of the cerebrum. So let me change colors here to help us find it. See down here at the bottom on my picture here, this area down here, and I'll zoom in a little bit to show you. This area down here that I did a terrible job circling in red, down here is my cerebrum. Now, the way that I can tell this is the cerebrum, remember on our previous picture we were talking about the two kinds of tissue that I find in it. I've got this darker color, this beige color here. That's going to be the gray matter of the cerebrum, and the gray matter is found all over the outside of the cerebrum. In the middle of the cerebrum, I can see right here this lighter color. This lighter color stuff that I'm looking at in here, this is the white matter of the cerebrum. You have to label gray versus white, but you will see when you're working on the brain activity that it asks you about where gray matter is versus white matter in lecture. So just know that I've got gray matter on the outside, white matter here in the middle of the cerebrum. So first thing that we're labeling is the location of the cerebrum, or in other words, where I find my so here's that part of my brain tissue that I see down here. The next thing that we could go ahead and label, since it's another major structure on here, is we can label our skull bones. So notice that we're asking you to identify where the bone connective tissue is. So when I'm looking on my model here, we actually see the very thin layer of bone connective tissue that makes up the skull. So here on the outside, not quite all the way on the outside, but here, right here is a thin layer of bone connective tissue. This is the bones of the skull that we're looking at here. Oh, here, let's see if we can remember way back from like week 6 in lab. When we talk about the bones of the skull, like my bones up here, first question for you, what's the name of the bones that live right here? If you guys can see, I'm putting my hands on the side of this here. Does anyone know these side bones? Yeah, good. A lot of us are remembering, and we have to re-remember for this week in lab. The bones that live on the side of your head are called the parietal bones. So let's think about those parietal bones, the ones that live on the side of your head. When we talked about the structural classifications of their shape to classify them, the parietal bones would be considered which of those structural classifications? Yeah, there we go. Got a lot of us chiming in. The parietal bones that live on the side of your head, the frontal bone that lives on the front of your head, the occipital bone along the back, all of them are flat bones. So when you look at a flat bone is going to have a really thin layer of compact bone tissue on the outside. There's my compact bone. And wedged in the middle, I can see that spongy bone in the middle of it. Now, we're not going to ask you to be that specific with the bone connective tissue. What we're labeling is just all of this, the fact that all of this is bone connective tissue. But just as a reminder forward that there are two types of bone tissue, the compact bone that I always find on the outside, and the spongy bone that I find mixed into the middle. So far we've identified our bone connective tissue. We've identified where our cerebrum is, where our brain is. When we talk about the cerebrum, there are a couple of features that I see on the cerebrum that let's go back and label. Those features are called a gyrus and a sulcus. When I use this word gyrus, can anyone give me an easy description of what a gyrus is? What would be an anatomy for babies word for what a gyrus is? Yeah, I love it, Parker. That's a great way to talk about it. A gyrus is a bump. So the brain has some bumps on the outside that make it not flat. Yeah, or a lump. Love it. Easy words. It also has some things that are called a sulcus. And a sulcus is an indentation, or maybe we could say a dip if we want to do an easy word for it. So a gyrus is something that's raised, or it's kind of a bump. A sulcus is an indentation, or a place where the cerebrum bends inside. So when I'm looking at my cerebrum that we labeled over here, perhaps the easier of the two to see is going to be my gyrus. See how there's kind of a bump right here? So this bump that I see right here would be a gyrus, the bumpy outer surface of the cerebrum. And notice how there's this little space right here where there's not really brain tissue. I've got a little blood vessel that's going down inside. That might be a good place for us to label a sulcus, because a sulcus is a place where the brain tissue is indented, where it's going inside. So I've got this bump, this gyrus, that's a raised place up here. And then next to it, I have this indentation where there's not brain tissue. And that indentation is called a sulcus. Sulci, by the way, can be really good, a really good place, like my model shows me, for a blood vessel to go down to the brain tissue. So an indentation is called a sulcus. A bump is called a gyrus. Those are both things that I see as part of the cerebrum. All we have left to label then are those connective tissue layers that we talked about, the meningeal layers. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to be the mean teacher. I'm going to have you guys help me out with this. So I'm going to put some numbers places. We're going to make this number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, and we'll put that here, 5. I know some of you are like, really? You're going to make me do this? Don't worry. We're going to check with each other. We're going to help each other out here. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to try to figure out what number the following things are. I want you to figure out for me which number on my picture represents the Arachnoid Mater. Don't text it to me yet. Don't send it in the chat yet. So first I want you to tell me what number is the Arachnoid Mater. Then I want you to tell me what number is the dural venous sinus. So you can start working in the chat for me. What number represents the Arachnoid Mater? What number represents the dural venous sinus? Let's light up my chat. Let's see. Okay, good. I'm getting a lot of votes for my Arachnoid, for my spider one. I like that we call it that, the spider one. The Arachnoid Mater is labeled here in my picture as number 3. So see this light blue, this seafoam green color that I see here? That is my Arachnoid Mater. It has these little spider web things that come down from it. That's my little strings of connective tissue that come down from it. The space underneath it that I see here labeled number 5 is a space that we have to know. It's the one that's underneath the Arachnoid Mater. So on my picture here, this space that I'm looking at right here, this space labeled number 5 is called the Subarachnoid Space. Yeah, the sub-spider space. I love it. Subarachnoid Space. Hey, who remembers, what's the abbreviation for what I find inside here? What's the name of the fluid that's inside here? What fluid lives here? There we go. Yeah, don't type out that whole beast, right? The fluid that lives inside here is called cerebrospinal fluid. Absolutely. Okay, so subarachnoid space is this space down in here. This thin seafoam blue layer that I see right here, that arachnoid mater, including its little stringies that hang down into that space. I also ask you to identify the dural venous sinus, and I know that I saw this number a lot from us. The dural venous sinus is this big open space right here, number 2, right here. We mentioned it briefly. Can anyone remind me, what do I find inside the dural venous sinus? What's inside there? Yeah, Emery and Rosa chiming in for me. Yeah, this is where I would find blood. Specifically, it's venous blood, which means that the blood that's inside of here is low oxygen blood. I put blood underneath. Low oxygen blood. When my body's done with, or when my brain is done with the blood that went up to it, it's going to dump it here into the dural venous sinus. Once it's in the dural venous sinus, we're going to recycle it back down into the heart for it to get oxygen again. So this big space up here is the dural venous sinus. I told you when we were labeling the Dura Mater before, when we were talking about it before, that the Dura Mater was really thick. So I think somebody asked the question, is that the beige one? Yes, the answer to that is it is the beige one. This really big thick layer out here, all of this is the Dura Mater. And it's so big and thick that it can split into a top half and a bottom half. And when it splits into the top half and the bottom half, that's how I generate this dural venous sinus, the space for the blood to be inside of. So we've labeled the Dura Mater, the thick layer on the outside. We've labeled the Arachnoid Mater, this seafoam blue area right here, this connective tissue here. The Pia Mater is really small. That's this thin layer of connective tissue that you see right here attached directly to the brain. So the Pia Mater is the thinnest layer, and it's right there on the very outside of the cerebrum. So when you're working on labeling structures and when you're studying, we'll clarify for you if we're talking about the connective tissue that's here on the outside of this structure, or if we're asking you about this structure itself. By the way, what part of the brain did we call this structure right here? Does anyone remember what part of the brain this whole big thing down here was? Yeah, this down here is my cerebrum. This is the brain tissue itself. So I would ask you for the name of the connective tissue that's directly attached to the cerebrum. This little tiny layer here on the outside, yeah, the pinkish, red, whatever we want to call it, that's the Pia Mater, that little thin layer. It's right there. We will come back to this model again next week as well. There's actually only one structure on here that will be new to us next week. And I'll highlight it since we're on this model right now. This little balloon structure that you see right here, we're going to talk about it next week. It's something called the arachnoid granulation. Arachnoid granulation, or sometimes you'll hear them called arachnoid villi. We said, you guys told me that there's cerebrospinal fluid that lives here in the subarachnoid space. Your brain is constantly making cerebrospinal fluid. When I constantly make it, I need to have a place to drain it. Otherwise, it's going to put a lot of pressure on my brain. So these little bubbles right here are actually ways that I can drain that fluid back into the blood. So arachnoid granulations will not show up on this week's homework assignment, but they will show up next week. We're basically doing the same model twice to make sure we understand where all those layers are, to make sure we understand what's going on. Okay, so let me zoom out. Before I move on from meninges, do we have any questions about meninges, these connective tissue layers? Or if you feel pretty good, give me a thumbs up. Let's see where we're at. Thumbs up or questions? No questions yet. Yep, I like that qualifier. We're good for now. Yeah, so Kathleen asked about the top part of our picture. This up here, yes, these big yellow dots that we see up here, These big yellow dots are fat cells, yes. And in previous semesters, we've actually asked people to identify this is adipose tissue. Here, let's go back to our discussion of the skin. When we talked about the skin, which of those layers of the skin had adipose tissue? Which of the layers of the skin had adipose tissue? Yeah, a couple of us we're racking our brain, right? It's been a while since we did skin. Yeah, it's the hypodermis layer of the skin that has adipose tissue. So we are seeing right here the hypodermis layer of the skin. Your scalp has thin skin inside of it. This outermost layer here, that encapsulates all of the dermis and the epidermis here on the outside. There's not a lot of stuff out there, but we do have this adipose layer, tissue layer here, the hypodermis. So yes, good question. That is adipose tissue that I see up there. Let's see, the layers underneath. Yeah, you don't need to focus on the stuff underneath the adipose. That's outside the scope of our class. Help me out. I got a couple of questions about a gyrus and a sulcus. When I talk about a gyrus or a sulcus, let me point to a different one that we talked about before. This right here that I'm looking at is a raised structure. Which of those words, gyrus, meant a raised structure or like a lump, something that was sticking up? Was that a gyrus or a sulcus? Yeah, so a couple of us have chimed in. A gyrus is a bump. So what I drew my little arrow to over here, this would be a gyrus, is a bump. The one that we labeled before was this one right here. There's another one right here. Any place where we see our cerebrum that is bulging up, that would be considered a gyrus. Anywhere where we see the cerebrum folding down, kind of like you see right here, was the one that we labeled. Technically, we could even label this little indentation right here. That little guy right there is also a sulcus. Yeah, I like Parker's statement as well. Sulcus says like a sulk. A sulcus is kind of like you sulking, where you get down, you're feeling bad. So a sulcus is places where the brain bends down. So my little sulcus that I see right here, or my big sulcus that I see over there. Just in general, a sulcus is something that goes down, and a gyrus is something that goes up. Gyrus and sulcus. Okay, so I think we're good on meninges. If you think of more questions on meninges, feel free to email me about them. Or like I said, it's going to come back next week as well. So remember, on the lab homework, you've got unlimited attempts. So please go through and do the lab assignment as many times as you have time for, to make sure we get all the labels right on this model. I want to show you two really important bumps really fast. So we're going to go all the way back to, it's page 2 of your packet, actually. Let's go all the way back to page 2. Here's some of those words that we just talked about, right? A gyrus and a sulcus. This is what it looks like, by the way, when we use Latin. A Latin word, gyrus and sulcus are both Latin. So this is what it looks like, more than one of them. But we have a couple of bumps that are really important. So important that we color-coded them. So if you see this model on your homework assignment, if you see it on the exam, know that we're probably using this model either for you to identify the lobes of the brain, or for you to identify a couple of our really important gyri, a couple of our really important bumps. So let's start with labeling this thing that's got an arrow right here. This thing that's got an arrow right here, this is an indentation. So remind me, my anatomy word for an indentation was what's that word for something that bends down? There we go. I got some votes coming in. This indentation is a sulcus, and this is the one sulcus that you have to know the special name for. The special name for the sulcus is called the central sulcus. This would be an underline highlight star. We got to know this guy. The central sulcus does a couple of things for me. The first thing it does is it divides up two lobes of my brain. So I'm going to put a note here, divides, and I'm going to make you guys help me out. The lobes of the brain that it divides matches the names of the bones of the skull that are right on top of them. So one of the lobes that this divides is the one that I find anterior in your brain. In my picture here, it's shown in kind of red or orange. What's the anterior most lobe of the brain? There we go. Yep. And some of us are giving me both of the lobes, my overachievers, right? You guys are jumping on me. So it divides the frontal lobe. That's the one in the very front, right? And then several of us were talking about the lobe that it divides that's right behind the frontal lobe. The name of that lobe, because we talked about those bones already, is called the parietal lobe. So it divides the frontal and parietal lobes. That's the first thing the central sulcus does. It divides up the frontal and the parietal lobe. But the second thing that the central sulcus does is it also divides the brain functionally. So what I mean that is on one side of this central sulcus, we're going to see motor activities, meaning making your body move kind of activities. And on the other side of this sulcus, this dividing line, we're going to see all the sensory areas in the brain. So the side, the stuff that I find in the frontal lobe, that's going to be the motor part of the brain. The stuff that I find in the parietal lobe is going to be the sensory side. Really, the only lobe of the brain that's doing motor type functions is this frontal lobe here in the front. Everybody else does a variety of different types of sensory stuff. So the frontal lobe, the orange-red one that I see on my picture here, this is where I'm going to do motor stuff in general. Back behind it is where I'm going to do my general sensory stuff, just kind of information like how hot something is or what its texture is. When we start getting into places like the temporal lobe on the side, or the one you can't see super well right now here in the back called the occipital lobe, that one helps with vision. So each of the lobes behind this central sulcus, or in this case underneath the central sulcus, they're all doing sensory stuff. The frontal lobe is where I do my motor stuff. Now, I told you that we were coming back to this slide not only for my sulcus, my central sulcus, but also for an important gyrus, actually two important gyri, two bumps. So the names of the important bumps that we're caring about on this model. So if I put a sticker or put a label on my red line, or here's the two options for the names. One of them is called the precentral gyrus. One of them is called the postcentral gyrus. That's the two bumps here that we have to be able to identify. We have to be able to label on the brain. Hey, this is not a trick question here. When I'm looking at these two bumps here, I have the red one that is in front of the central sulcus and the blue one that is behind the central sulcus. Would I find the precentral gyrus, is that going to be in front of or behind the central sulcus? Yeah, there we go. We're all saying it's going to be in front of, right? It's going to be anterior. So the precentral gyrus is anterior or in front of the central sulcus, which means that the postcentral gyrus is going to be posterior or behind the central sulcus. It's going to be back behind it. Let's see if we can do our applications then. The precentral gyrus is in front of the central sulcus. Is that the only blue one? Yeah, it's the only one that shows up really blue. So this right here is my postcentral gyrus. It is part of this whole lobe right here. It's one special bump inside of this whole parietal lobe right here. But it's the one line that's really bright blue. Let's do an application then. Precentral gyrus, you guys told me, is in front of the central sulcus. If I'm in front of the central sulcus, is that going to be motor or sensory? What kind of functions are in front? Yeah, there we go. We're chiming in. It's going to be motor. The precentral gyrus, in the words of your lab packet, is where I'm going to find the primary motor area. Or let me give you a teaser for what we're going to call the primary motor area in lecture. We are going to say that the primary motor area has something called the motor homunculus. The motor homunculus, that's the same thing. So make a note for yourself in your lab packet, just so that when you see this terminology in lecture, it doesn't freak you out entirely. It's the same thing. The primary motor area is where I find the motor homunculus. This is going to be a map of all the places along that bump in your brain. So there's a map of your whole body that goes along this bump here in your brain, and it'll tell you exactly where in your body you're contracting or controlling muscles. So motor homunculus and primary motor area, same thing. Both of those are found in the precentral gyrus. The postcentral gyrus then is where I'm going to find, in the words of your lab packet, the primary sensory area. Primary sensory area, or what we're going to call it in lecture, is the sensory homunculus. Sensory homunculus, same thing. Put a little line here for us. Okay, so we want to make sure we know if this model shows up and I've got an arrow pointing red part right here. What I am pointing to is called the precentral gyrus. If I've got an arrow pointing to the blue part right here, I'm pointing to the postcentral gyrus. If I've got an arrow like we see here pointing down into the groove in between them, that's the structure called the central sulcus. And the central sulcus is going to help me to divide up, like we started with, the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, but it's also going to help us to divide up the motor part of the brain from the sensory part of the brain. So the central sulcus is all about dividing things. My two gyri, precentral and postcentral, that's where I find those motor and sensory areas. Carrie asked about the sensory homunculus. All you want to know right now is just that the way your lab packet is referring to it, it's calling it the primary sensory area. We'll have a whole page in our lesson just about the sensory homunculus, so don't worry too much about it right now. It's just the same thing as the primary sensory area. Okay, so precentral gyrus, postcentral gyrus. So precentral is only one part of the front, correct? Yes, the precentral gyrus is only one part of the lobe. It's just the one bump that I find right in front of the central sulcus. Kind of like how the postcentral gyrus is just one bump that I find in the parietal lobe. It's part of the parietal lobe, but it's the one bump that's found right behind it. Postcentral gyrus, one bump, precentral gyrus, the other bump, but they are both part of a lobe of the brain. Absolutely. Okay. What I want to go to, because I know I got a bunch of requests on this one, is this right here. This right here. Help me out. What page? Yeah, we're all saying yes, please. Yeah. What page in the packet? Page 6. Okay, page 6. We will probably not label everything together. We will label some of our things together. What I will tell you is there are lots of pictures in the guided lab activity this week. No, they're not 100% a match to this exact model, although I will tell you I think we included the pictures that are a 100% match. But the best approach for how to label this model is to go through and do it kind of piece by piece. We talk about the different brains without having you label them one by one, but labeling them one by one is probably a good idea. So there's lots of pictures Oh, awesome. Leslie said she was able to find them all. So perfect. Yeah, the videos are helpful too. Good. So we'll go through. I'm not going to label everything with you. I will label some of these things with you. We'll talk about some of the functions as we label them, but I won't talk about all the functions. You've got a lot of good resources in the guided lesson to help you out with those functions. So let me zoom in a little bit. I really probably should have made my list in two things because I'm going to have a hard time reading those words there. Okay. So when we're looking here at my model, let me ask you again, when I look at this model, the way they cut the brain is in a left half and a right half. What's the kind of plane that we use to cut the brain? What kind of plane did we use on this model? Yeah, I got a couple of us voting in here. This is another model that we did a mid-sagittal plane on, where we did halfway through the middle to generate equal left and right pieces. So we are seeing one of my hemispheres, one of my halves of the cerebrum, and we are seeing everything that's visible from the of that part. So let's start on the outside. So here on the outside, we have our bone tissue. But if you notice from what we asked you to do on the labeling with the bone tissue, we did ask you to go specific on this one, just kind of as a review for us, of compact bone versus spongy bone. So it's going to be hard for me to label those things with how, yeah, because I'm getting closer. So help me out. When you're labeling on your paper in front of you, is it compact bone or is it spongy bone that I find on the outside of the skull? What kind of bone is on the very outside, this outermost layer of the bone up here? Yeah, so a lot of us are chiming in. The kind of bone that's on the outside of the skull is the compact bone. So compact bone on the very outside of the skull, it's also the kind of bone tissue that's on the inside of the skull, the very innermost layer. All this little stuff in here with the holes, the little stuff with the holes that I find here in the middle, that is spongy bone. It's like a sponge. It has holes inside of it. So compact bone on the outside of the brain, spongy bone there in the middle. Then there is another layer of compact bone right underneath that spongy bone as well. Working our way from the outside, we finish with the bone tissue that's out here, the compact and the spongy bone. And then we bump into this blue tube right here. This blue tube right here is filled with blood. So can anyone help me out? What am I looking at here with this blue tube that's filled with blood? What's this structure here that stretches from the front to the back of the brain? Yeah, there we go. A couple of us are identifying it. This blue tube that I see here is that dural venous sinus. So the dural venous sinus, remember I told you guys that the job of the dural venous sinus was to drain oxygen poor blood. So we are draining oxygen poor blood out of the brain and away from the brain through this tube that goes all the way from the front all the way to the back. So the blue tube that I see up here, that's the dural venous sinus. Remember that the dural venous sinus forms when I split the two layers of the dura apart from each other. So I make a space inside the Dura Mater to make the dural venous sinus. So I'm going to do a really poor attempt. Let's see if we can do this here. You see the little white line. I kind of went into the blue there. But see, there's one white line and there's two white lines. The white lines on either side of the dural venous sinus, that's the Dura Mater. So the two white lines, that's the Dura Mater. The Dura Mater splits in half, allowing us to make this dural venous sinus. So the Dura Mater on either side of the dural venous sinus. That's where I see that. We cannot see our other meningeal layers that we talked about. So the Arachnoid Mater, not visible on this model. The Pia Mater, not visible on this model. Remind me, is it the Arachnoid Mater or the Pia Mater that is directly attached to the surface of the brain? Which one is directly attached to the brain? Yes, lots of us chiming in. The Pia Mater directly attached. So if we, on this model, were to zoom in way close on the model, we might be able to see Pia Mater directly attached here. The Arachnoid Mater would be closer to the Dura Mater, because remember, we have that subarachnoid space, the place where there's the cerebrospinal fluid. All right, so we got our bone on the outside. We got our Dura Mater that's next to it, the dural venous sinus in between. Now we start getting into the structures of the brain itself. I apologize. Let me look at my list real fast. Okay. We didn't ask you to label it, but I know you guys can do this for me. If I ask you to label all of this right here, what is my anatomy name for all of this stuff right here? What part of the brain is this part right here? The biggest part of the brain. Yeah, there we go. Mary Beth, Eileen, chiming in for me. Yep, Rosa. Excuse me. This big part of the brain up here, all of this is the cerebrum. So we didn't ask you to label it because you've labeled it many other times in the packet, but all of this is the cerebrum. Primarily what you're labeling on this model are structures that are part of an area of the brain called the diencephalon. The diencephalon. That's a new word for us, and we are going to do it more in lesson number 11. The end of this week and first part of next week. Let me just make a quick couple of notes for you here. The brain has 4 parts. So the first part is what we've already talked a lot about, the cerebrum. It also has the region that I just mentioned for you, the diencephalon. The diencephalon is kind of inside. It's in the very middle. Then we have a region called the cerebellum. And our last region of the brain is called the brain stem. The brain stem. 4 big regions of the brain. When you are going through and studying these parts of the specific parts of the brain, make sure you can sort them into these groups. So which of these structures lives in the cerebrum, which lives in the diencephalon, which lives in the cerebellum, and the brain stem. So the way your packet's organized is it goes through region by region to divide up those structures by region. I want to talk briefly here about the diencephalon, what structures are in there, and then we'll label some of them together. When you see this diencephalon word, I want you to always be thinking thalamus. The main part of the diencephalon is called the thalamus, but I also have a couple of parts that are called the hypothalamus and the epithalamus. Hey, hypo is not new to us, the beginning part, hypo. When I use hypo, what does hypo mean? Can anyone remember what that beginning part means? Hypo. Yeah, so it means under, it means below, it means lower. Exactly. The diencephalon has the main part of the diencephalon is going to be a big region called the thalamus. But then I have a region that's down below it called the hypothalamus. And then I've got a region that's more above it called the epithalamus. So when you think about parts of the diencephalon, that should be the trigger word for you that you're thinking of when you hear diencephalon is thalamus. It all has to do with the thalamus. So let's start by finding some of these diencephalon structures. The big structure out here, we said, was the cerebrum. That's my big structure here. Okay. So when I am looking inside the brain, notice how there's kind of this region right here that looks a little bit like the face on a duck. So this big region right here that makes up kind of my duck face that I'm looking at right here. This big region right here, this space inside here, this is the thalamus. This is the thalamus. So the face of my duck, that's the thalamus. Notice in the very middle of my duck's face, he's got this little brown eye right here. This little brown eye is a specific structure that you're going to learn the function of. The structure here in the middle is called the intermediate mass of the thalamus. The job of the intermediate mass of the thalamus, the job of the duck eye, is to connect the left side of the thalamus to the right side of the thalamus. See here in the very middle, inside the thalamus, in the middle of it, it's actually filled with fluid as well. It's also filled with that cerebrospinal fluid that we talked about. So I have my duck face right here that's representing the thalamus region. The eye on my duck is called the intermediate mass of the thalamus. When I look down kind of into the beak region of my duck right here, so kind of my beak region, that right there is the area called the hypothalamus. Remember, hypo means below. So think about the hypothalamus as the duck's bill. Think about the thalamus as the face of the duck. The eye is this intermediate mass that we talked about. And the last structure that you're learning is this little pink thing that's sticking out right here. The little pink thing that's sticking out right here has a technical name. Its technical name is called the pineal gland. Pineal gland. The pineal gland is the part of the epithalamus that we're having you learn. So pineal gland and epithalamus, for the sake of our discussion, they're the same thing. So when we think about the parts of the diencephalon, we've got the duck face. The duck face is the thalamus. We've got the duck bill. That's the hypothalamus. We have the epithalamus, or what we're calling it is the pineal gland, that sticks out above and kind of in the back. That's kind of like the little feathers that are on the back side of a duck's head. So the diencephalon, that's all this stuff here in the middle that's going on that looks kind of like a duck. That's the structures that I see that are part of that innermost part of the brain. A couple other structures that you are labeling that are also part of this innermost part of the brain. Here is an underline highlight star. We must know this structure. Like, there's no way we cannot know this structure. This big white band right here. For my friends who have labeled, what do I call this big white band right here? Who knows what I call this thing right here that I'm circling? We must know this guy. Absolutely. Okay. Got a couple of us chiming. That big white band right there, we must know. I'm going to put it in caps. It's called the Corpus Callosum. We must know Corpus Callosum. Corpus Callosum is this white band right here. The job of the Corpus Callosum is to connect the left side of the brain to the right side of the brain. We must know this guy. We got to know what he does. We got to know where he is. So this big white C that I see up here, this is called the Corpus Callosum. We must know that. Connects the two sides of the brain together. Fun fact with the Corpus Callosum is we can actually treat seizures by actually cutting the Corpus Callosum, because the Corpus Callosum allows the left side and the right side of the brain to talk to each other. Sometimes a seizure is that the left side of the brain tells the body to do one thing and the right side of the brain tells the body to do another. So if I stop them from talking to each other by cutting this, sometimes that can be used to treat seizures. So Corpus Callosum, my white band here, we must know that. I'm guaranteeing that's either going to be an identification question or it's going to be a function question. You're going to have to know that one. So make sure we know our Corpus Callosum. There is one other little white band underneath it that I'm going to point out. Little white band there. That little white band there is something called the fornix. The fornix. So kind of on top of the duck's head there is a structure called the fornix. That's going to be related to what we call the limbic system. Limbic system, which is all about your emotions. So this other white band that we see right here, this white band right here is a structure called the fornix. And the job of the fornix is to help us get information into our memory centers to help us with emotional memories. So two white bands to look at right there. Okay, my picture is way messy, so I'm about ready to clear it off. If you want to snap a picture on your phone, if there's anything you feel like would be helpful. Looks like a big mess to me, but I'm going to erase my board here. Okay, here goes the great erase. We're going to move down. Okay, so we've talked about the cerebrum. We've talked about the diencephalon, the stuff here in the middle. We are now going to move down into a region called the brainstem. Brainstem. And the brainstem has 3 parts to it as well, just like the diencephalon does. It has a part called the Medulla Oblongata. It has a part called the pons, and it has a part called the midbrain. Okay, let's see if we can help each other out with this. I am going to put some boxes on my picture here, and I'm going to see, we'll put some numbers on them. Okay, up here is box number 1. Here's box number 2, box number 3. When I look at these boxes, although now I'm realizing it really blocks the structures, doesn't it? Let's see if we can figure this out. Which of these boxes, 1, 2, or 3, which of them represents the medulla oblongata? For my friends who already labeled this, help me out. 1, 2, or 3. Do we know who the medulla oblongata is? Yeah, okay. So several of us have labeled and have identified that box number 3 is the medulla oblongata. My boxes weren't helpful, so I'm getting rid of them. Here we go. Here's where number 3 was, down here at the bottom. Medulla oblongata. This is the lowest area in the brainstem. The medulla oblongata actually attaches to the spinal cord. So this is where the brain attaches to the spinal cord. So lowest area is that medulla oblongata. That's that very lowest area. Right above it on the front, I have a big thing here. Who can tell me the name of the big bump on the front side of the brainstem? Yeah, see, I don't feel bad making guys type that one, right? That one's a little bit easier. That big bump there is something called pons. And the word pons literally means bridge. The job of the pons is to connect the medulla oblongata up to the rest of the brain. The pons also helps me to connect the 2 sides of the cerebellum to each other. Cerebellum coming up next. Teaser for us here on the back side of the brain. That's where the cerebellum is. So my pons is my bridge. It attaches what's going on up here to what's going on down here. It also helps to attach the 2 sides of the cerebellum to each other. So that leaves for me this little region right here. If anybody deserved a box, it's this region right here. This little region right here is called the midbrain. So the main claim to fame, or the main function of the midbrain, honestly, is that it has some structures attached to it. And it's the structures that I find here on the back side of the midbrain. They are a little bit hard to see when you're looking at this particular picture and this model. What I will say is some of my other brain model pictures show them better. So check out the guided lab activity and check out those labeled images. The structure that I have back here is something called Corpora Quadrigemina. Corpora Quadrigemina. Literally what that weird Latin name means is 4 bodies. 4 bodies, or 4 bumps. There are 4 bumps that live back here in this region. What you want to know about those 4 bumps is that they help me with auditory reflexes and visual reflexes. So if we were in class together and I was a mean teacher, this would be when I would like throw a skull at you to see if you move. I mean, I hope you move. That'd be a visual reflex where you duck out of the way. Or I could drop a big heavy anatomy textbook on the floor, slam it on the floor, and we'd all jump. That's an auditory reflex. So you responding to things that you see or things that you hear in a reflexive way, that's these bumps back here, the Corpora Quadrigemina. So 4 bumps on the back side of the midbrain. When you're learning the function of the midbrain, literally the packet says it's the location of the Corpora Quadrigemina. Brain's pretty boring. So these 4 bumps, my Corpora Quadrigemina, they are the real stars of the show. They do auditory and visual reflexes. Okay, so that's the brainstem. Yeah, so that's a great tie-in for me, Eileen, because the last thing for us to talk about, the big brown thing here in the back. This whole thing is the cerebellum. And in a lot of ways, the cerebellum is just like the cerebrum. It's just smaller. We have gray matter on the outside. That's what's all brown for me. We have white matter on the inside. Now, the white matter on the inside is something that I want to make sure we know. This is going to be another underline highlight star because it's my favorite. The white matter on the inside, just exactly right what Carrie said. The white matter on the inside is called the Arbor Vitae. Arbor Vitae. So this is the white matter in the cerebellum. The white matter cerebellum, it's called the Arbor Vitae. So if you've got an arrow that's pointing directly to this white matter here in the very middle, that's called the Arbor Vitae. Literally what Arbor Vitae means is the tree of life. Tree of life. I love it. It's like so poetic. The tree of life, Arbor Vitae. But here's what makes it even more cool too, or I mean, brace yourself, right? I'm an anatomy teacher, so what I think is cool, you're not going to think is cool. Whatever. The gray matter of the brain, of the cerebellum, excuse me, is arranged in what's called folia, kind of like foliage. So the folia are the leaves, the gray matter that I find on the Arbor Vitae, the tree of life. So when we talk about the cerebellum, you don't have to know the folia. That's just a fun tidbit that you can have from me to you. There's my gift to you, is the folia. So what we do need to know is the white matter being called the Arbor Vitae, the tree of life. So that's the white matter here in the middle of the cerebellum. The gray matter all on the outside, arranged in those things called folia, which you don't have to know. Inside the cerebellum, here's another fun fact for you. Inside the cerebellum, which is much smaller in size compared to the cerebrum, we actually have the same number of neurons that live inside this little tiny space right here compared to how many live in all of this space up here. The cerebellum is folded so much more, which is why when you look at a picture or look at a model, it has way more bumps in it, way more gyri and sulci than the cerebrum does. It has to have all of those bumps because that's going to increase the space that it has for neurons to live. So just as many neurons that live down here in the cerebellum as live up here in the cerebrum. Okay, so I've hit most of the structures here. I want to make sure that we have some time to talk about bone markings and about movements. So there are some that I missed. I know I missed them. Do your best with the guided lab activity. Do your best with Google Images to see if you can find those other ones. And if you really have a hard time finding them, bring me specific structure questions today. We should have some time on Friday to identify ones that we missed. But I want to make sure I have some time for bone markings and for movements. So I'm going to go ahead and move on at this point. To help me with moving on, I am going to bring it with, like I said, Martha, bring it on Monday. Maybe try to use other sources, see if you can find structures that you're having a hard time finding. To help me out here with bone markings, I'm not going to be able to go through and show you all of the bone markings, but I'm going to pull up some of our pictures. Let me zoom out here. I think I heard someone say they had questions about markings on the temporal bone. I can definitely help out with the temporal bone. Can you guys help me out in that? What are some of the specific bone markings we're most interested in seeing? Because I'm going to try to show you some on my little skull that I have right here, and then we'll also try to point out some in pictures, since pictures are a little bit bigger. I'll definitely go through and hit up the temporal bone. We're scouring our lab packets. We're now toward the end of the packet. See if we know any particular ones. Okay, so the external acoustic meatus, the mastoid process, definitely. I can do both of those on the temporal bone. The lacrimal bone. Yeah, I can try to show you that, definitely. I'm going to be honest with you. That would be one that would be easiest for us to see in lab. Let me see if I can even... My skull probably doesn't even have enough definition for me to find it. So I'll see if I can find one of our pictures that we have in here for me to try to show you that. Emery's asked about the protuberance. So the external occipital protuberance, perhaps. I can definitely show you that. The sutures. Yeah, we can definitely do sutures. Absolutely. Well, let's start with this picture. and we can look at a couple of the things here. So help me out. What page are we on the packet where you've got these pictures here? What page do we bump to? Okay, looking like page 7. Okay, so on page 7, there are 2 pictures of the skull that you can see. We've got the lateral view of the skull up here on the top, and then I've got the anterior view of the skull right here. Primarily, it looks like the structure I'm most interested in talking about are more on the lateral side of the skull. So let's talk about those. One of the things that you guys asked me about in the chat were those sutures. So here's my box of the sutures here. Hey, one of these suture names, we should definitely be able to find it and identify it because it matches up with those planes I keep talking to you guys about. We talked about coronal planes. Coronal planes. Yeah, so coronal, like Kathleen said. When I ask you about a coronal plane, I know this is going to take a little more typing. Which kind of pieces did it cut the brain into? When I did a coronal plane, it cut the brain into blank and blank. Yeah, there we go. Anterior, posterior, we could say front and back, right? So I am looking for a suture. Remember, we did sutures whole bunch in lesson number 1, right? Or in lecture number 1. Sutures are my, ooh, yellow's not going to fly. 1 minute. Sutures are places where my skull bones attach. Still can't spell it. Sutures equal skull bone attachments. So when I look at the skull, I've got a suture here. I've got a suture here. I've got a suture here that we need to know. So let's pretend that we got number 1, number 2, number 3. When I'm looking at my 3 sutures here, which of these looks like the way that line goes makes something look kind of like front and back or anterior and posterior? Which one would match a frontal plane? Absolutely, exactly. We're all chiming in. So number 1 up here, this suture is called the coronal suture. So it's attaching or it's forming it's sitting on you just the same way that a coronal plane would sit on the top of your head. Hey, I'm gonna ask you guys to help me out with this. The coronal suture attaches together 2 bones of the skull. Which 2 bones of the skull does the coronal suture attach together? Yep, we're all chiming in on my frontal. We got the frontal bone, this guy up here. And yep, a couple of us are chiming in. The one back behind it, this big one back here, that's my parietal bone. Absolutely. Hey, a good way to study sutures would be a question like that. What 2 bones together? This one does the frontal bone and it does the parietal bone. Okay, so coronal suture sits like a coronal plane. Connects together the frontal bone and the parietal bone. Then we go over here to suture number 2. So I'm going to circle suture number 2. For my friends who have already labeled, can you help us out here? Is this one the squamous suture or the lambdoid suture? Do we know? The one here on the side? Yeah, the one here on the side is called the squamous suture. The way I kind of like to think about that one or remember that one is squamous. The word kind of looks squiggly to me. That has the same first 2 letters anyway. So this squiggly one on the side is the squamous suture. The squamous suture, it still attaches to the parietal bone. That's one of my bones here, right? Parietal bone. What's the name of this bone right here? What's that bone right there called? It's the one that you'd find right here on you. Yep. It's going to be the temporal bone. So the squamous suture holds together the parietal bone and the temporal bone, connects those 2 together. I find that one on the side of the skull. So the last one we have back here by process of elimination is the lambdoid suture. And the lambdoid suture back there helps me to attach the parietal bone up top to this bone right here. What's the bone at the back of your skull called? Who lives in the very back? Yep, occipital bone back there. So the lambdoid suture attaches the parietal bone to the occipital bone in the very back. The other benefit to studying your sutures, as in like which bones does it connect to each other, when you're going through and trying to figure out which sutures you can see in each picture, see what bones you can see. Because if I know that the coronal suture attaches together the frontal bone and the parietal bone, if I can see those two bones in my picture, then I should be able to see the coronal suture. Or if I can see the parietal bone and I can see the temporal bone, then I should be able to see the squamous suture. So study these sutures as in what bones do they connect, and study their general locations. That's my hint on those guys. Let me clear off my chicken scratch here. We'll talk a little bit about markings on the temporal bone. One of the markings we want to make sure that we know on the temporal bone, because it's important for our movement question this week, is this big thing right here. Who knows the name of this big triangle down on my temporal bone? This big triangle. Not the mandibular process. It is a process. We are on the right track. Styloid is actually this little guy in front of it. Styloid process is the little one in front of it. We're naming all my processes, right? Zygomatic process, here I'll give a teaser, is right here. So which one haven't we said yet? Can we tell? Can Tyler? The meatus is a tube. Let me help us out. This one gave us some trouble, sounds like. Right here. Mastoid process. Mastoid process. This big one that we see right here. This big thing right here. And let me see if I can show it to you on the skull here. So let me hold it up close. If you can see, I know it's small. This big point that hangs down right here on your skull, this is called the mastoid process of the temporal bone. The mastoid process of the temporal bone is massive. So it's really big, the mastoid process. Looking at the temporal bone, this big thing that sticks down. Remember, a process means something that sticks down or sticks up, a protuberance. Reference back to week 6 where we sorted those things. So my mastoid process is this big thing that hangs down off of the temporal bone. This is going to be the attachment site for one of the muscles we're learning this week called the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Sternocleidomastoid, that last part of its name, means that it attaches to this thing called the mastoid process. So this big attachment site, let me zoom in and erase. The big thing here on my temporal bone, the big triangle, the big one is the mastoid process. Right in front of it, yeah, Carrie's mentioning you can kind of feel it behind your ear. Yep, it kind of sticks down. And when you feel, if you turn your head to the side, you can kind of see, let me show you here on Muscle Man. You can see his sternocleidomastoid muscle. You can feel that same muscle in your neck. When you feel where it attaches up underneath your ear in your neck, where it's attaching to back there is that mastoid process. So the really big one back there that we see on the temporal bone, that's the mastoid process. Right in front of it is the little one that hangs down. It's still a process. It's still something that sticks out, but it's really small. So the really small one is called the styloid process. Way back in the day, here I'll age myself here, the cool thing used to be what they called a Palm Pilot, where you had this little thing that you could write notes on, and you used a stylus to do that, or a little pen to use that. So the little small one that we see in the front is the styloid process, like a stylus. The mastoid process is really massive back behind it. Mastoid process, styloid process, the little one. I know it's been a while since we did bone marking words, but here's a reminder for us that a meatus is a tube, or it's kind of a hole, a passageway. The external acoustic meatus of the temporal bone, this is your ear canal. It's the bony part of your ear canal. So the circle that you see on your thing that I kind of accidentally colored over there. This dark circle right here is the external acoustic meatus, and that's where sound waves are going to go in to your ear so that you can actually process them. Somebody mentioned for me the zygomatic process. Let's have a quick discussion. There are two tricky processes for us to know when it relates to zygomatic and temporal. So here we go. We have on the temporal bone something called the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. The zygomatic process bone is the back part of your cheekbone. Now I know it's hard to see, and I wish that you all had a skeleton at home. But when you're looking at a skull, let's see if we can kind of see it here. Kind of, maybe. When you're looking at a skull, your cheekbone extends all the way, and you'd feel it on yourself. It extends all the way from the very front of your cheek all the way to the very back, your cheekbone. All of that is what we might call the zygomatic arch. So everything that's your cheekbone from front to back is actually made of two bones together. The back part of it that I circled in black for us is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. But we also have the front part of your cheekbone that we see right here, that I circled here in the front. The front part of your cheekbone is called the temporal process, the zygomatic bone. I want you to underline, highlight, star those two names. The zygomatic process of the temporal bone, let me go down to the table, and the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. The name of the process that I am learning is the name of the bone that it attaches to. So here's what I mean by that. This right here is called the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, because this thing that sticks out attaches to the zygomatic bone. It's technically part of the temporal bone. That's why its last name is on the temporal bone. But it is part of, it's part of the temporal bone. So it's the temporal bone where it attaches to the zygomatic bone. Therefore, I call it the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. In the front, though, I've got the part that sticks out in my cheekbone that attaches to the temporal bone. So this is the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, because it's technically part of the bone on the front of your face called the zygomatic bone. So please don't mix those two up. Remember, on the homework assignment, we're used to starting to do this, where we match up the name of the bone. First we give the name of the bone marking, then we give the name of the bone. With these two bone markings, the name of the bone marking is opposite of the bone that it's found on. But it really just comes down to, what do you attach to? Do you attach to the zygomatic bone, or do you attach to the temporal bone? So zygomatic process and temporal process of those two bones there. Let me switch to, zoom out here. Let's go to another view. By the way, this is the picture that you have in the guided learning activities. Same with this one here. Also in those labeled images PowerPoint. So you've got those things available for you. This would be what page? Are we page 8 now? Is this page 8? Looking at the back side and the inside of the skull? Yeah, okay, page 8. Okay. What are some of the bone markings that we wanted some help finding on page 8? What are some of the specific ones? Help me out. Oh, we feel good about page 8. Okay, at least one of us. If you feel okay about this page, that's cool too. I know one thing that Emery had asked about was something called the external occipital protuberance. So I'll help you out with that one. The external occipital protuberance, it's something that sticks out. See this bump right here? It doesn't quite look like a bump. You can kind of feel it on the very back of your head. It's going to be a really important attachment site for your big trapezius muscle of the back. Let me see if I can pull up my little skull here. Again, I know it's super small, but there's a bump in the very middle of the occipital bone. That bump in the very middle of the occipital bone is called the external occipital protuberance. So it's the bump there in the middle. And on the sides of it, see how we can see these little ridges right here? Those are my nuchal lines. So the nuchal lines, they're there by that occipital protuberance. Here would be a bone marking that I'm going to say is an underline highlight star right here. Oh, I need to stop trying to write, right? Because it's just not working. I'll do yellow. Sella Turcica, underline highlight star, this one. Sella Turcica. The Sella Turcica is an indentation that, again, I wish that we had a skull in front of you for you to look inside at. There's this indentation in the middle of the sphenoid bone. The sphenoid bone, by the way, is kind of a bat-shaped bone in the middle of the skull. Here we go, my attempt at art right here. All of this right here is the sphenoid bone, and it hugs the brain. The brain sits on top of it, but there's this little indentation that I see right here. It's a divot. This divot or this indentation that I see right here is called the Sella Turcica. Literally, the word Sella Turcica means Turkish saddle. And inside the Sella Turcica is where I find a structure called the Pituitary Gland. The Pituitary Gland. And you're learning about that in the brain portion of the packet, but it lives right here inside the Sella Turcica, inside the little divot right here. Hey, by the way, one of the bone markings that we have to know is the foramen magnum. What does that word foramen mean? The word foramen. Yes. Yeah, so the word foramen means a hole. Foramen magnum, literally this magnum word means hole. So we're looking for a big hole. I look down inside of here. Well, that looks like a pretty big hole, right? There's foramen magnum. So use those marking words to help you identify it. Carrie asked about the Sella Turcica. It's shaped like a saddle from the front view. From the front view, it's hard for me to tell you. I know from the side view, when you look at it, there's an indentation. There's a divot for it. And when you're looking at, when we were labeling all those structures on the brain, the cross-section of the brain in the middle view, you're able to see it there as well. So when you find the pituitary gland, the bone that you see sitting around it, it looks like a saddle, or it looks like a divot for the pituitary gland. All right, let me zoom back out. Yep, so there's that external occipital protuberance, that bump, and those lines that we talked about. Again, these are just pictures taken from your labeled images PowerPoint. Bottom view, we can start to see, remember those structures that we talked about? Again, we've got the temporal process and the zygomatic process. So just make sure we don't mix up what bones those guys are found on top of. Here is a word, fossa. Here I'll give you a little reminder for us. The word fossa means that it's an indentation. So anytime you see the word fossa, that's an indentation. I've got a couple of indentations. Here's one right here. Here's one right here, where the jawbone, called the mandible, would rest inside of. So the mandibular fossa is the indentation where I find the jawbone. They're inside of there. All right, so use those labeled images. They're there in your guided learning activity to help you label things. Again, if there are specific ones you're having a hard time finding, bring their names to our time on Friday, and I'd be happy to go through and kind of look at a few more bone markings with you. In the bit of time that we have left, though, I want to talk muscles. Help me out. Are there any particular muscles that we're having a hard time finding? Because I'll focus more on movements if we can, but if there's a particular muscle that you're having a hard time finding, let me know what that muscle is, or give me a thumbs up if we're okay with identifying them. Do we need to know all of the markings from the labeled images or only the ones in the packet? It's always just the ones in the packet. So there's some extra ones labeled, the ones that are in the packet. Make sure we know that. Okay, I got a question about the masseter muscle. We can definitely do the masseter. The masseter muscle, for my friends who are able to find it, let me ask you a question in a kind of a different way. What is one of the bones that the masseter muscle is attached to? Can you help me out? What's a bone that the masseter muscle is attached to? Yeah, so several of us are saying the masseter muscle is attached to the mandible. Absolutely. The job of the masseter muscle, its function is to help with something called mastication. Mastication is a fancy word for chewing. Chewing. Oops. So the masseter muscle helps me with mastication, helps me with chewing. The one that's going to help me to chew is my mandible. It's my lower jawbone. So the masseter muscle is going to be this little guy right over here. It is hiding, so the muscle that's inside of here, it's kind of hiding a little bit underneath the yellow structure. The yellow structure that you see right here is actually a salivary gland. So to help you remember that it's the masseter that lives right over there, think about how the masseter helps you to chew, and it's right next to the salivary gland. That's going to be spitting out the saliva with your chewing. So that's the masseter there. Hey, let's see if we remember from our muscle labeling activity, this word orbicularis. What does that tell me about my muscle? Orbicularis. What does orbicularis mean? Okay, several of us are saying I will challenge you on I. The I part of its name actually is back here, oculi. Orbicularis was one of my shape words. Orbicularis is a shape word. So orbicularis means that it's making a circle, that it's a circle muscle. Several of you did correctly identify Orbicularis oculi is the one that I do find by the eyes. That's what oculi means, the eyes. But the orbicularis part of its name means that it's encircling, or it goes around. Where would I find Orbicularis oris? Where's Orbicularis oris? Yeah, oris is like your oral region. It's around the mouth. So Orbicularis oris around the mouth, Orbicularis oculi around the eyes. Eileen asked if Orbicularis oculi is muscle number 2. That would be correct. Yes, that's the label that I see on my model here. This circle one that goes around the eyes, that's Orbicularis oculi. Yep, and then Emery identified for us the circle one that goes around the mouth, number 6. That's going to be Orbicularis oris. Absolutely. I'm probably not going to go through, so here's your labeled images again to help you out with locations. I'm not going to go through and do all of the actions with you because I know you've got great websites in the guided learning activity that help you with them. But here's the thing that I would encourage you to do even before you look at the websites to help you with matching up the functions of the muscles. I would encourage you to try to do these actions with your own face and feel your face and your facial muscles to see if you can figure out which muscles are contracting. So, for example, one of the movements that we want to know is we want to know which of our muscles from this to elevate the eyebrows, to raise the eyebrows. So if you put your fingers on your eyebrows and then you elevate them and feel your face to figure out which part of your face my muscles seem like they're getting shorter in. So when I've got my fingers on my eyebrows here, to elevate them, I'm pulling them up. I need a muscle that's going to go from this length to this length and pull my eyebrows up. I'm going to need a muscle that's above them. So elevating the eyebrows would be the job of my frontalis muscle. That's up high, because that muscle goes from being longer to being shorter to pull those eyebrows up. Orbicularis Oculi, because we got that vote. Orbicularis Oculi makes a circle around your eyes. If I took my circle that was this big and I squeezed it to this big, which of those actions do you think might happen? So the action options that you have on that page, which of those actions do you think might happen if I took that circle and squeezed it smaller? Any guesses what Orbicularis Oculi might do? Yeah, we're voting blinking or closing the eyelids. Exactly. Yes, so Orbicularis Oculi is going to help us to close those eyelids, squeeze them down and together. So use the locations of these muscles, feel them on yourself. When you act out some of these actions, closing the lips, closing the eyelids, you might have to do a little bit of reading for who elevates the mandible and retracts the mandible. Those ones you'll probably have to read about. But once you get the answer to who does those things, feel these muscles on your face in action. Because remember, when you take the lab final exam, you've got your face. Please feel free to do an interpretive dance with your face, kind of like I told you guys in lab. Do your interpretive dance, act these things out, and that's probably the way to go. Yeah, I'm glad to hear, Eileen, you said that makes sense. Absolutely. So go through, again, keep acting things out, because that's the best way to learn, to involve your body in the learning process. I want to work with you guys on our origin and insertion activity, the last part of the lab packet. Remember how this process works. Oh, lovely typos. So we're going to work together on this last activity to help us with predicting actions. So let me get out my different colors here. Here's a friendly reminder for you guys that on the final exam, we are going to ask you to predict muscle movements. And I told you guys this last week when we were doing our office hours with these activities. I'll tell you again, when we take the final exam, either I'll give you the name of bone markings, kind of like we did here, where we give you the name of bone markings and then ask you to predict actions based on the names of the bone markings. Or I might give you a picture where I've got something labeled as the origin and the insertion and ask you to predict what that muscle does. So the reason we're practicing each week with these origin and insertion activities is to get you ready for making predictions. So let's start with labeling our origins and our insertions in the picture, and we'll go from there into making predictions about actions. So the first thing that we ask you to do in the packet is to label the origins blue. When I talk about the sternocleidomastoid muscle, there are two origins of this muscle, two places where it attaches. These bone markings are actually reviews from way back a couple weeks ago. So the bone markings that are review questions for us, or reviewings for us, are something called the manubrium of the sternum, and it's actually the medial portion of the clavicle. It's a little more specific in your lab book here. So do some typing here. Well, first, sternum is all of this right here. Remember from when we were studying the thoracic cage or our chest stuff, all of that is the sternum. So I'm going to put some numbers on my sternum here, and you guys are going to help me figure out which part is the manubrium. So I'm going to put a number 1 here in the middle, put a number 2 up at the top, and I'll put a number 3 down at the very bottom. Can anyone remember from way back when we did the chest, the manubrium of the sternum? Was that the top, the middle, or the bottom? We're looking for the number. The manubrium of the sternum. Awesome. Okay, bunch of us are remembering. Okay, Carrie, you don't know? This is why we're reviewing, right? So the manubrium of the sternum is the top part of the sternum. So this up here, of the sternum. This larger region down below it, down here, this is called the body of the sternum. And then there's this little tiny extension down here at the bottom called the xiphoid process of the sternum. So 3 different parts of the sternum. We are specifically attaching to the part that's called the manubrium. So Like clear off my markings here. We are attaching to the top part of the sternum. So one of my origins is up here. I make a blue mark for myself. Here's the manubrium of the sternum. We also said that the sternocleidomastoid is attached to the medial portion of the clavicle. That word medial, what would be the normal person word for medial? When I use that word medial, what does that mean? Yeah, toward the middle, right? So the medial portion of the clavicle, the medial portion is toward the middle. That's going to be this part right here, the medial portion of the clavicle. These are my two origins of the muscle. So remember that muscles have an origin and an insertion. When I talk about an origin, my origins do or do not move. Does an origin move when a muscle contracts? It does not. Absolutely right. These are my two places when this muscle contracts that there will be no movements. When muscle contracts, my insertion is going to move toward it. So I'm going to label on my picture now the place where this muscle attaches, what is going to move when I do the process of muscle contraction. The insertion of the sternocleidomastoid is the mastoid process. That's why I made sure I did that one. Remember the mastoid process, the massive thing that sticks out? So my mastoid process is this triangle right here. See the triangle hanging down? This is the one that like Carrie mentioned for us. We can feel that one back there. So there's my mastoid process. My mastoid process is the moving attachment site. My manubrium of the sternum and the medial part of my clavicle is the non-moving attachment site. All I have left to do then, for the sake of my studying, is to draw on my muscle. So I'm going to do some connect the dots here. Connect the dots down from my two origins to my insertion. Now, when it comes to predicting the actions of muscles, this is when I really want you, again, to use your body. So if you feel on your body up behind your ears, where we have the mastoid process, the attachment site, and if you feel down that muscle, you can kind of trace that muscle down to where it attaches to your clavicle on the top and where it attaches to the sternum on the top as well. When we're talking about moving this attachment site up top closer to this attachment site down here, you can literally do this action on yourself. Bring my mastoid process closer, either by rotating to bring them, or if I'm moving both of my mastoid processes down toward my attachment sites down here, I'm bending my head forward. So I've got my two origins that are down here, and I've got two of these muscles. Sternocleidomastoid is on both sides. If I contract both sides, I take the two insertions on the side of my head, and I pull both insertions down toward my origin, which is in the chest. My head goes forward. I'm flexing anteriorly. If I just deal with one of those insertions and bring it toward my origin, we start to do some rotation on the head, where we're rotating that head in. So we go down. Yep. So when we're doing our rotation, we're rotating this medially. We're rotating this toward the middle of the body, and we are pulling our head anteriorly, pulling it down. Excuse me. So again, with all of these, we are talking about acting out these actions. The only muscle that we're really learning origin and insertion for this week is sternocleidomastoid. But we had a lot last week, right, when we were doing this stuff with the legs. So lots of things to practice your origins and insertions with. Please make sure to take some time for these activities. And remember, when we talked about the legs, there's not really general rules that apply when we just have one muscle that we're talking about here in the neck. But generally, there are rules that apply to whether you live on the front side or the back side of the body. Please make sure you're going back and reviewing those from last week. Please make sure you're not forgetting about those muscles of the rib cage or the muscles that we find in the abdominal cavity. Keep reviewing and acting those things out. We breezed our way through that stuff. So when we talk about rotation, we're going to consider the way that the mastoid process moves. So Pilar, the way that it's moving is it is rotating medially. It's going from being more lateral to being more medial. And I'll check to confirm the terminology on the homework assignment on that, just to confirm. I believe that the way that we're phrasing it is that it rotates it medially. Carrie asked, do we have to memorize the origins and the insertions? No, do not memorize the origins and the insertions. What we might ask you to do on the exam is give you a picture of a muscle that we've never done this origin and insertion activity with, and ask you which bone marking is most likely to be the origin. The way you would approach a question like that is if my answer choices were the mastoid process of the temporal bone, or the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, excuse me, or the alveolar process of the mandible, we would give you a list of bone markings that only one of them is remotely close to where the attachment is. So you're not memorizing these origins and insertions on any of the muscles, but have an idea if you know where your bone markings are, and I ask you from a list of 4 options where the bone markings are all over at different places, we should be able to identify it from a lineup, if you will. So imagine that I've got 4 bone markings. Which of these is the one that, based on its location, makes sense to be an origin or insert? So don't memorize them. I'm not going to ask you about those. Good question. Okay, so we're asking about the flexion and the extension. Okay, so let me scroll down to the bottom part down there. This is where we should probably pull together or remind ourselves of our movement words. When I use the movement word extension, what does extension, when you're doing that on yourself, how would you describe what the movement of extension looks like? And we can even, the way that I like to teach flexion and extension is with your arm, right? So is it when my arm comes up or when my arm goes down that I'm doing extension? The arm coming up or the arm going down? Which one is extension? Yeah, the arm going down. Extension is when, with my biceps, when my arm is going down. Technically, like Ariel said for us, the technical definition of extension is that the angle between my bones increases, or maybe more technically, even the distance between my bones increases. When we talk about extension of the skull, we've got the skull in its upright position, and we have 2 options. I can either bend that skull farther away from the sternum, so doing extension, or I can bring that skull closer to the sternum. That would be doing flexion. Because when we talk about flexion, flexion is when you bring 2 things closer together. So decreasing the angle or bringing them closer together. So when we think about attaching, we have our attachment site up here on the front part of the skull that goes down here to the sternum and the clavicle. When I talk about bringing this skull attachment site down to this side of the sternum and the clavicle, I am flexing it down together. I'm decreasing the angle or the distance between them. If I wanted to extend the head, if I wanted to pull it backwards, I would have to use muscles that have origins and insertions on the back side of the head. So I'm doing flexion because I'm pulling toward the front side of the body. Pilar asked about it being opposite in the leg. We can't always say that going toward the front or going toward the back is flexion and extension. What we can always say is when bones get closer together versus when bones get farther apart. That is always true. So when bones get closer together, that is always flexion. When bones get farther apart, that is always extension. So those definitions are always true. When we think about the arms, when we think about the head, when we think about the torso, we can also say going forward or going backwards, but it gets a little bit funky with the legs. Yeah, that's correct. All right, any other last minute questions? Yeah, so the lecture test is going to be available online. Yeah, Ariel, you're in the Friday class, so probably Friday is going to be your best bet to take it. I believe it's going to open up online starting on Wednesday morning for my Wednesday lab friends, or my Monday, Wednesday lecture friends. It's going to stay open until Friday evening. So you will see it opening up for you Wednesday morning at 7:30. It's going to close Friday night. That is for everyone. Yes. Now, here's where I'm going to need you guys to help me out. Once that exam opens, we are on the honor system where we are not talking to each other about questions. If you see something that pops up in GroupMe that looks like a test question, I need you to do me a favor and get in touch with me, because that's not okay. So I'm leaving the test open Wednesday through Friday because I know a bunch of us, myself included, have little ones at home, have job responsibilities. I'm going to leave that test open for everybody from Wednesday to Friday. But again, it's not for us to work on with our neighbors. It's for us to take the time by ourselves to complete it and knock it out. So Friday at 11:59. Yes. The test will be timed. I will be giving you a minute per question. It's going to show you one question at a time. Depending on the number of questions, it's going to be somewhere in the ballpark of probably 50 to 60 minutes. So you will need to start planning now to carve yourself out a period of about an hour that you distractions. You get one attempt on the test. So you sit down. Once you start that test, the clock starts, and you will have, like I said, it'll be 50 to 60 minutes depending on the number of questions. I should have that information for you hopefully Monday, have an idea of exactly how long it will be. Can you go back and change answers? I believe that you can. Yes, Leslie, I'm going to try to set it up that way. But remember what I always tell you guys when you take a test with me, right? Go with your gut, so don't change too many answers. It should give you the option to change it, but it's going to show you the questions one at a time, so it's not going to be easy for you to get back to questions you might want to change, which is probably a good thing, right? It's going to be harder than just erasing an answer and changing it. So you should still have the option, but I recommend against that because you were probably right at the beginning. Yeah, so more details to come about that test. By Monday, I should be able to tell you. But now, if you're for your planning purposes, if you're trying to get ready for childcare or for your work planning, plan on needing to have a window. Go ahead and plan for yourself 75 minutes. I don't think it's going to have 75 questions, but to give yourself the technical time that you need, plan for 75 minutes sometime between Wednesday morning and Friday evening. Here, let me get a whiteboard. I'll type it up right here. Okay, here we go. Exam number 3, going to be available Wednesday, April 8th at 7:30 a.m. It will be open until Friday, April 10th at 11:59 p.m. Hey, you want to think in your mind that it's not 11:59? You better plan to be done well before 11:30. And do not send me an email Friday night saying, oh my gosh, it doesn't work. Because you know who's going to be asleep at 11:59 on Friday night? This one right here. Going to be sleeping off my back pain, right? Okay. So it's going to be open from Wednesday at 7:30 in the morning to Friday at the end of the day. It will be 1 minute per question. One question at a time. One attempt on the exam, just like in class. So here's our parameters for that exam. 1 minute per question, one question at a time, We get 1 attempt. Thank you, Carrie. Yes. Please do me a favor, and if you can get this information out into the GroupMe, if Carrie's not in your GroupMe, if it didn't just light up in your GroupMe, please do me a favor and send a message out to your class. Yes, this is going to cover the material from lessons number 9. So number 9, number 10, and number 11. Correct. Yeah, so Carrie's in the Tuesday, Thursday class. Please send this information out to my Friday friends, as well as my Monday, Wednesday friends as well. Pauline asked if we're going to have a review. Yes, I'll open up the floor for us on Wednesday. So since it's the first day of the exam, our session that we'll do together during office hours on Wednesdays, you can bring me any questions that you have from each of the lessons. I won't have any set plans. We will spend Monday and Tuesday of next week talking about lesson number 11, talking about the brain stuff. So yes. Yeah, Eileen. Yeah, you've been here all the time, Eileen. I bet you'll do well. Yeah. All right, so let me check out my questions here. Any other exam questions that we can think of now? And we'll talk about it more on Monday. Okay, well, what I'm going to do really fast is I'm going to end the recording for the day. But again, please make sure all my classes get this information out in their GroupMe, just so that we all are on the same page for exam number 3. So goodbye to my friends on the recording. We'll see you again soon.